Spent the last 3 years fortifying the rugged, rocky high ground on either side of it with trenches that overlooked the beaches. The high ground rose sharply in the form of natural rocky terraces, like giant steps, providing defensive positions for machine gunners and riflemen. It would be easy enough for the Royal Navy to land troops on the beaches at Aqaba, assuming troops could be made available for that purpose. But once ashore, they would have to fight their way uphill against a stubborn and well-entrenched enemy, in a landscape whose chief feature, apart from blistering, overwhelming heat, was a lack of drinking water, except for the few wells forming the strong points of the Turkish defense system. Many British officers underrated, even despised the Turkish army. The general opinion was that Turkish soldiers were poorly trained and poorly armed, as well as slovenly, cruel, and reluctant to attack, while their officers were effete, poorly educated, and corrupt. This opinion persisted, despite the fact that when a combined British, Australian, and New Zealander army landed at Gallipoli in April 1915, in an attempt to take Constantinople and open up a year-round warm-water route through the Dardanelles to Allied shipping, without which the beleaguered Russian Empire seemed certain to collapse, it was fought to a standstill by an inferior number of Turks. The British were obliged to evacuate after 8 months of fighting, leaving behind 42,957 dead, in addition to 97,290 men seriously wounded and 145,000 gravely ill, mostly from dysentery. The failure at Gallipoli briefly ended the hitherto charmed political career of Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, who had been a prime mover of the campaign. The defeat also ensured the collapse of the Russians' army and their monarchy, and ought to have taught the British that in a defensive role Turkish soldiers were as stubborn and determined as any in the world. Further proof was not lacking. Twice the unfortunate General Sir Archibald Murray, who commanded the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, tried to break through the Turkish lines in front of Gaza, and twice British troops were driven back with heavy losses by the unyielding, entrenched Turkish infantry. As for the corruption of the Turkish officer class and politicians, while it was notoriously widespread, here, too, there were exceptions. When a British army advancing from the port city of Basra in what was then Mesopotamia, and is now Iraq, in an attempt to capture Baghdad, was trapped and surrounded less than 100 miles from its goal in the town of Kut al-Amara in December 1915. The British government tried to bribe the Turkish commander to lift the siege. A 28-year-old temporary second lieutenant and acting staff captain named T.E. Lawrence, on the intelligence staff of General Murray's predecessor in Cairo, was sent by ship from Suez to Basra with instructions from Kitchener himself, then Secretary of State of War, to offer the Turkish commander, Khalil Pasha, up to £1 million, about $90 million in contemporary terms, to allow the British forces in Kut to retreat back to Basra. On the morning of April 29, 1916, Lawrence and 2 companions, one of them Aubrey Herbert, a member of Parliament and an expert on Turkey, walked out of the British lines with a white flag and, after being blindfolded, were led to Khalil's quarters, where, following lengthy negotiations in French, he firmly but politely turned the offer down, even when it was doubled at the last minute. Since it was by then too late for the 3 British officers to go back to their own lines, Khalil offered them his hospitality for the night, and gave them, according to Lawrence, a most excellent dinner in Turkish style. Of the 13,000 British and Indian soldiers who had survived the 147-day siege and were still alive to surrender at Kut, more than half would die in Turkish prisoner-of-war camps, from disease, starvation, malnutrition, the effects of a harsh climate, and Turkish incompetence, indifference, and cruelty with regard to prisoners of war. In the autumn of 1916, less than 6 months after the dinner with Khalil Pasha behind the Turkish lines at Kut, Aqaba.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.